Hi, Assalamualaikum. A very good day to all our friends and our financial management, Madam Zaibeda. Today, I would like to present financial ratio analysis for company FGV Holding Berhad and IOI Corporation. Before we begin to further, let me introduce my name is Haziqah and my team members Siti, Ashiah, Mohmmad, Fadlin and Lina, Ameraah. We choose FGV Holding and IOI Corporation company because we believe plantation industry is a main income to our country. FGV Holding is agribusiness and is an affiliate of the Federal Authority with operation worldwide. FGV produce oil palm, rubber and oleochemical with material sourced from federal colonies throughout the country. For IOI Corporation, commonly referred to an industrial oxygen incorporate Sdn Berhad. IOI is one of Malaysia's biggest that venture into property development and followed by oil palm plantation and refineries. For the categories of ratio is divided by 5 categories, which is liquidity, efficiency, leverage and profitability ratio. Liquidity ratio is a class of financial metric used to assess a debtor's ability to pay current debts obligation without raising external capital. There is 3 types of liquidity ratio. First is current ratio, which measures the ability of company to cover its short-term obligation with the current asset within 1 year. Secondly is the quick ratio, which measures the ability of a business to pay its short-term liabilities by having assets that are readily convertible into cash. And third is net working capital that measures difference between current asset and its liabilities. How we determine the current ratio? The current ratio can be calculated by dividing current asset with the current liabilities. Let's take a look at the comparison current asset between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 to 2021. As we can see, in year 2020, IOI stayed 2.7 times and the next year decreased to 1.05 times. Meanwhile, FGV increased the current ratio as stayed 1.65, although both companies still enough funds to meet his current financial obligation. Next is quick ratio. The calculation for quick ratio is current assets plus account receivable divided by current liabilities. As we can see, in year 2020, IOI stayed at 1.37 times and decreased to 0.47 times. Meanwhile, for FGV, in year 2020, it stayed at 0.43 times and the next year is 0.44 times. Therefore, both companies has more likely struggle with paying debts. Moving on to net working capital. To calculate net working capital ratio, it indicates the amount of total current asset minus the total liabilities. As we know, in 2021, IOI decreased from 3,049 to 340. Meanwhile, FGV increased from 296 to 1,063. It means FGV had a poor short term to paying its debt and conversely, IOI has more than enough to cover its short-term debts.
Second step we need to determine is efficiency ratio. Efficiency ratio is measure of how well company utilize its resource to make a profit. There are 5 types of efficiency ratio. First is average collection period. Secondly is account receivable turnover. Third is inventory turnover. Fourth is fixed asset turnover. And last one is asset turnover. Let's take a look to average collection period. To determine the amount of ACP, we calculate by account receivable divided by credit sale and multiply by 360. Let's take a look at the corporation average collection period between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 until 2031. The graph of ACP for year 2020 to 2021, IOI collect their debts as state 10 days to 110 days, which means that IOI took more time to collect its payment from the client, which is a negative sign for a company. Meanwhile, for FGV Holding, collect their debts as state from 60 days and decreased to 30 days in year 2021. It shows that FGV Holding managed efficiently to collect their credit terms to financial health. We take a look at the fixed asset turnover. How do we calculate fixed asset turnover? The fixed asset turnover is amount of sale divided by net fixed asset. Let's look at the corporation fixed asset turnover between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 until 2021. In year 2020, FGV stayed the fixed asset at 0.82 and increased to 1.08 at year 2021. It indicates that FGV is better performing in generating more revenue per ringgit of assets. Meanwhile, for IOI in the year 2020 is 0.46 and decreased to 0.06. It may also IOI Corporation has lack of collection period. Moving on to inventory turnover. How we calculate inventory turnover? We calculate by cost of goods sold divided by inventory. Let's see the corporation inventory turnover between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 to 2021. In year 2020, FGV stayed their inventory turnover in negative 10.4 and decreased at negative 8.8. Meanwhile, in year 2020, IOI stayed their inventory turnover at negative 6.1 and increased the inventory ratio at negative 6.9. We can see for both companies may be a sign of weak sale or excess inventory. And the last one is receivable turnover. How we calculate receivable turnover? We calculate by sale divided account receivable. Let's see the corporation receivable between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 until 2021. The diagram show in year 2020, FGV stayed at 54.6 and increased at 109 to the next year 2021. This may indicate that FGV is collect their collection practice are efficient which quality customer will pay their debt quickly. Meanwhile, for IOI in year 2020, the receivable turnover stayed at 35.1 and decreased in year 2021, which is 32.5. It could be the result of inefficient collection process and customers who are not financially viable for IOI.
Let's move to leverage ratio. Leverage ratio is any one of several financial measurements that assess the ability of a company to meet its financial obligation. Type of leverage ratio, debt ratio, the equity ratio, time interest earned. So how we calculate debt ratio is by the firm of total liability divided by total asset. Let's take a look. Debt ratio between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within 2020 to 2021. As we can see, for year 2020 is 42% and the year next year is decreased to 41% for FGV Holding. In year 2020, FGV stayed at 62% and dropped to next year 60%. Therefore, IOI Corporation is managed their cash flow as smoothly, meanwhile FGV had a greater debt ratio because FGV has more debt than asset. Next, debt equity ratio. To calculate debt equity ratio is the amount of total liability divided by total equity. Let's take a look debt equity ratio between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation in year 2020 to 2021. As the diagram show in year 2020 to 2021, IOI had the same ratio which stayed at 0.7 and FGV in year 2020 is stayed at 1.8 and dropped to 1.5. Therefore, IOI Corporation maintained their debt equity ratio which is a low risk financial. Conversely, FGV had high investment risk. Last one for the leverage ratio is time interest earned. To calculate time interest earned is earning before it tax as known as EBIT divided by total interest earned. Let's take a look time interest and debt earned between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation. As we can see in year 2020, IOI stayed at 12.1 ratio and the next year 2021 it increased to 45.7. It indicates that IOI still enough fund to pay its debt. Meanwhile, in the year 2020, FGV Holding stayed at 2.6 and the next year dropped to 1.5. The result, FGV were not sustainability and needs to fulfill its financial obligation.
profitability ratio is financial metrics used to assess a business ability to generate earnings relative to its revenue, operating costs, balance sheet assets, or shareholder equity. There is 4 types of profitability ratio. First is operating profit margin. Secondly is net profit margin. Third one is return on equity. And the last is return of asset. How we calculate operating profit ratio? We calculate by earning before it tax, as known as EBIT, divided by sales and multiple by 100. Let's see the operating profit margin ratio between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 and 2021. In the year 2020, FGV stayed at 2.5% and increased to 8.8% in year 2021, which is more than 6.3% in year. Meanwhile, IOI stayed at 10.6% and increased the next year on 2021, stayed at 15.5%, which is more 4.9% in a year. Therefore, for both companies is managed efficiently in generating profit through its core operation. Okay, for the next slide is net profit margin ratio. How we calculate net profit ratio? We calculate by earning after tax, as known as EAT, divided by sales and multiple 100. Let's see the net profit margin ratio between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 to 2021. In the year 2020, FGV stayed at 0.95% and increased to year 2021, stayed at 6%, which is up to 5.05% in the year. Meanwhile, IOI in year 2020 is stayed at 8% and increased the next year, 2021, stayed at 13%, which is increased 5% in the year. Therefore, for both company has efficiently managed in generates percentage of revenue received. Next, we take a look on return on equity. How we calculate return on equity? Return on equity is calculated by earning after tax divided by total common equity and multiple by 100. Moving on the return equity ratio between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 to 2021. In the year 2020, FGV stayed at 14% and increased to 16.4%, which is increased to 2.4% in a year. Meanwhile, for IOI Corporation, in year 2020, stayed at 6.3% and up to 14% in the year 2021, which is increased 7.7% in a year. As a result, for both companies are efficiently managed in generating for those profits. And the last is return on asset. How we calculate return on asset ratio? We calculate by net income divided by total asset. Let's take a look return on asset ratio between FGV Holding and IOI Corporation within year 2020 and 2021. As a diagram show, for the year 2020, FGV stayed at ROA ratio as at 0.78% and increased to 6.54%, which is increased 5.76% in a year. Meanwhile, IOI in a year 2020, it stayed 3.59% and increased to 8.01%, which is increased 4.42% in a year. Therefore, for both companies are efficiently managed in productive its balance sheet to generate its profit.
So we have seen and heard the explanation about each of the ratios. To conclude the financial ratios of FGV Holding and IOI Corporation, we could see clearly both company has more asset rather than liquidity. Therefore, both company has efficiently managed in operating and financial leverage, and the cons for IOI is need to focus in inventory and increase more revenue in collecting period. That's all for comparison both companies' ratios. Thank you.